The flock she was given was not a gift, it was a joke dressed as one. 63 lambs, culled from 3 different herds for the same reason each time, knock-kneed, undersized, born late in a season that punished lateness. The rancher who signed them over to her, a widow of 26 with a homestead of stone and stubborn grass, did not bother hiding his smile. Everyone in the valley knew what a gift of weak lambs meant. It meant, fail quietly, and fail soon. Her name was Adelia Voss, and she took the lambs anyway, because a flock of anything was still a flock, and a flock was still a start. The land she'd inherited from her late husband's uncle sat low against a bend in Cutter Creek, in a hollow the old-timers called the Sink. Good grass, bad water, that was the local wisdom. The creek ran high in spring, and vanished by July, leaving nothing but a cracked bed, and a well that pulled up water so mineral-heavy it left rings on every pail. Nobody had ever wanted the Sink. That was why her husband's uncle got it cheap, 40 years back, and why he'd died there poor. But he had left one thing behind besides the land, a notebook, water-stained, bound in waxed canvas, tucked inside the chimney stone where the mice couldn't get it. Adelia found it her first week, looking for a draft. Ezra Thorne had not been a rancher by trade. He'd been a well digger, and, before that, apparently, something closer to a hydrologist, self-taught from books he'd carried west and never mentioned to anyone. The notebook was full of sketches, cross-sections of soil layers, sworn measurements of where the creek bed sat lowest, notes on clay strata and the particular cold of certain rocks in August. On the inside cover, in a steady hand, he had written a single line, * water does not vanish. It only goes where no one has thought to look. Adelia read that notebook by lamplight for 11 nights running. She did not know it yet, but the man's 40 years of quiet failure were about to become someone else's foundation. The first winter, Cyrus Pell owned the biggest spread in the valley, and the loudest opinion about everyone else's. He'd watched 3 families try to make the Sink work and fail, and he told Adelia, without much unkindness in his voice, that she'd be the 4th. Bad water, and worse lambs, he said, leaning on her fence rail the week she moved her flock down. That's not a ranch, Mrs. Voss. That's a funeral with grass on it. She didn't answer him. She had already started digging. Ezra's notebook pointed to a spot 200 yards east of the dry creek bed, where he'd recorded the ground temperature as 5 degrees cooler than anywhere else on the property. Even in high summer, a sign, he'd written, of water moving underground, close to the surface, cooled by rock instead of sun. Adelia paced it out with a borrowed dowsing rod, more out of superstition than science, but it was Ezra's numbers that told her where to dig, not the rod. 22 feet down, through packed clay, and then a layer of gravel that ate her shovel blade, she struck damp soil. By 26 feet, the hole was filling faster than she could bail it. She'd found water. Not the surface trickle of Cutter Creek, but something steadier, an artesian seam, cold and mineral clean, moving under pressure from somewhere higher in the hills. Her first attempt to bring it up nearly killed her. She cased the well with green pine boards instead of seasoned oak, and on the 9th day, the walls buckled, collapsing 11 feet of shaft and burying her makeshift pump under 2 tons of wet clay. She climbed out with a gashed shin and a ruined week of work, and Cyrus Pell, riding past, only shook his head. Ezra's notebook again saved her. A later page, near the back, described exactly this failure, his own, decades before. Green wood swells wrong in wet ground. Season the boards a full year before you truss them below the water line, or use stone. She hadn't read far enough the first time. She read the whole book twice more that week. She used stone the second time. Fieldstone, mortared with a lime and clay mix Ezra had also recorded, cured for 11 days before she let a single lamb near it. The well held. By the time the last snow melted, the Sink had water no other ranch in the valley could reach, cold, steady, and independent of the creek entirely. Her 63 lambs, still thin, still knock-kneed, drank from a trough that never ran dry. Cyrus Pell noticed. He said nothing that spring, but he stopped calling it a funeral. Napashid, the second summer, The lambs grew, not fast, Adelia had no illusions about that, but steadily, on grass no longer rationed by a dying creek. She began terracing the slope above the well, another of Ezra's sketches, cutting shallow shelves into the hillside to slow rainwater and feed it back underground instead of letting it run off into gullies. It was slow, back-breaking work, done mostly alone, though a young hand named Thomas Reyes, 16, orphaned onto a neighboring farm as cheap labor, started showing up on Sundays to help for nothing but bread and conversation. Thomas asked more questions than he answered. He wanted to know how she knew where to dig, why the terraces curved instead of running straight, what the clay-lime mortar was for. Adelia found herself teaching before she'd ever meant to be a teacher. She let him copy pages from Ezra's notebook into a battered ledger of his own. Her dog, a rangy shepherd mix named Gully, adopted the well site as his post, sleeping in the shade of the stone housing through the worst of the summer heat. Her one horse, a sway-backed mare called Pinch, hauled stone up the terraces until her legs shook. Cyrus Pell rode by twice that summer. The first time, he said nothing at all, which Adelia understood to be its own kind of concession. The second time, in late August, he asked, gruffly, like the words cost him something, how deep she'd gone for water. 26 feet, she said. Yours might be different. The ground's not the same everywhere. He grunted and rode on. It wasn't friendship, but it wasn't mockery either. Nscreffer, asterisk to the disaster ***. It came in the third spring, 2 years to the month after she'd taken the flock. The rains that year were wrong from the start. Too much, too fast, dumped over 4 days onto ground still hard from a dry winter. Cutter Creek, which had never held water past July in living memory, rose out of its bed on the second night, and kept rising. Adelia woke to gully barking and the sound of water where there should have been none. The flood didn't just fill the dry creek bed, it found the low seam of the sink itself, the same underground pressure that fed her well now working against her, pushing groundwater up through soil already saturated from above. Her lower pasture, where 40 of her flock were penned for lambing, went under in under an hour. She and Thomas worked by lantern and lightning, wading into water that reached Adelia's waist, cutting fence wire to let the flock scatter uphill rather than drown penned. Pinch, spooked and half swimming, dragged 3 lambs clear on a lead rope wrapped twice around Adelia's fist before the rope tore her palm open. Thomas went under once, caught on submerged fence wire, and came up only because Gully had seized his sleeve and would not let go until Adelia reached them both. They lost 4 lambs that night. 59 survived. Adelia counted them twice at dawn, sitting in wet clothes on the one dry rise of ground, unable to stop shaking, but the well held. Ezra's stone casing, 26 feet down, did not buckle, did not flood with silt the way every other ranch's shallow wells did that week. And more than that, the terraces did what Ezra's notebook had promised they would, slowing the runoff enough that the worst of the water missed the house and the winter stores entirely. Cyrus Pell's lower fields, dug the old way, straight cut and unterraced, lost 11 cattle and half his hay to the same 4 days of rain. He rode over on the 5th morning, hat in his hands, and looked for a long while at the water still standing chest deep in his own bottomland, while Adelia's terraced slope ran clear. 26 feet, he said finally, echoing her from the summer before. You said the ground's not the same everywhere. It isn't, she said. He didn't apologize. That wasn't his way, but he asked, that day, if she'd walk his land with him come the following month, and tell him where he'd gone wrong. Nubbub. ***, 2 years later ***, the valley remembered the flood, the way valleys remember disasters, as a marker, a asterisk before asterisk and asterisk after asterisk, etched into every conversation. Adelia's flock, 59 strong, and growing fat on terraced grass and clean well water, was no longer a joke. Wool buyers who'd once ridden past the sink without slowing, began stopping to inspect her clip, heavier and cleaner than anything else in the valley, the flock's mineral-rich water working some quiet alchemy on the wool's grease and staple length that the buyers could not entirely explain, but were willing to pay extra for. Thomas Reyes, 18 now, had his own ledger 3/4 full, copied and recopied from Ezra's notebook, but increasingly filled with his own observations too: soil color after rain, which slopes held terraces best, how deep to case a well in sandy ground versus clay. Adelia had stopped correcting his sketches months before. They didn't need correcting. Cyrus Pell's own well, dug that autumn to Adelia's specifications and cased in stone instead of green pine, struck water at 19 feet. He never thanked her outright. But he sent over a bull calf, unasked, the week the well came in, and told the man delivering it to say nothing about who it was from. ***, the 4th year, a new neighbor ***, a family named Okafor took the failed Hutton spread that spring, sight unseen, drawn by a cheap price and a land agent who'd never mentioned the words Dry Creek. The husband, Solomon, rode over within his first week, warned by 3 separate neighbors that the woman at the sink was either a witch or a fool, and that he ought to see for himself before believing either. He found neither. He found a stone well 2 years weathered, a terraced hillside gone green even in a dry spell, and a ledger, no longer just Ezra's, but Adelia's own by now, thickened with her own numbers, that she opened for him without hesitation. It isn't luck, she told him, walking him along the terrace lines. It's just paying attention to what the ground already wants to do, and helping it do that instead of fighting it. Solomon Okafor dug his well at 19 feet, using her measurements as a starting guide, adjusted for his own soil. It came in clean on the second attempt. The valley had a new saying by then, one that traveled faster than any flood story. Asterisk, ask the woman at the sink before you dig. Asterisk, asterisk, the fifth spring. Asterisk, asterisk. Thomas Reyes married that spring and took a parcel of his own, 2 miles up creek, gifted partly by Cyrus Pell, who by then had become, in his gruff and wordless fashion, something like family to them both. Pinch had died the winter before, old and swayback to the last, and a young gelding named Bram took up her place, hauling stone, though nothing, Adelia said, would haul quite like Pinch had. Gully, grey-muzzled now, no longer chased the flock but still slept at the well's stone housing every afternoon, as though standing a post he'd never been relieved of. On the morning Thomas left to start his own land, Adelia handed him a notebook. Not Ezra's, his was too fragile now to leave the house, its pages softening with age and handling. This was a new one, waxed canvas like the first, filled these 5 years with her own hand, every failure, every correction, every number she'd bled or nearly drowned to learn. He gave me his, she said, now I'm giving you mine, don't let it sit in a chimney for 40 years before anyone reads it. Thomas didn't say much. He rarely did. In the end, he'd learned that from her, or maybe from the land itself, which said everything it needed to say without raising its voice. He only nodded, and tucked the notebook inside his coat, over his heart, the way she remembered doing with Ezra's the very first night she'd found it. Asterisk, asterisk, years later, asterisk, asterisk. The sink was not called the sink anymore. Newer families called it Voss Well, or sometimes just the well, as if there had only ever been the one worth mentioning. Adelia was gray now, still narrow-shouldered, still slow to smile, walking the terraces some mornings with a cane she pretended not to need. Wool from her flock, descended now 3 generations from those first 63 culled lambs, sold at prices that would have made the rancher who'd handed them over in mockery choke on his own joke. She did not dwell on the money. She dwelt, when she thought of it at all, on the numbers. 26 feet, 19 feet, 4 days of rain, 63 lambs become thousands of pounds of clip a year, 1 notebook become 2, 2 become, she'd heard, from a traveler passing through, 5 or 6 now, copied and carried to dry hollows in 3 other counties by settlers who'd never met her but had met someone who had. Thomas Reyes, thick through the shoulders now, gray coming early at the temples the way it had for his own late father, brought his daughter to the sink most autumns, to walk the original terraces with her the way Adelia had once walked them with him. The girl was 11, sharp-eyed, unafraid of getting mud past her elbows, and she carried her own small ledger, begun that year, its first pages copied dutifully from her father's, in a hand still learning its own shape. On the last evening of that autumn visit, Adelia found the notebook open on the porch rail, left there by the girl while she chased Gully's successor, a rough-coated pup named Ember, through the yard. She did not read far, only the most recent entry, dated that week, written in a child's careful, uneven print beneath a line copied, she recognized, from somewhere much further back in the family of pages that had led to it. Asterisk, water does not vanish, the girl had written. Asterisk, it only waits for someone patient enough to follow it home. Adelia read it twice, the second time slower than the first, and did not correct a single word.